Welcome back to the Politics with Paul podcast, your home for nonpartisan discussion of political science and civics. I am your host, Paul Rader. It's another guest episode, and for such episodes, always add a disclaimer that I do not take a stance for or against any guest's political views, but this is not a partisan or ideological discussion anyway. And unfortunately, many congressional elections have become quite predictable. Republicans and Democrats each have a significant number of districts that are all but guaranteed to be won by their respective party. And more than that, primary elections are often heavily geared towards the most well-funded and most extreme candidates. And it's led to many voters of different partisan persuasions to feel like the nominating process isn't fair or representative. But what if it could become fairer or more representative? What if it could become more localized and grassroots oriented? Enter today's guest, Tom Joseph, founder and treasurer of America's Main Street Party. AMSP proposes a people's primary, which seeks to create a moneyless nominating system that relies on local committees rather than party insiders or big donors. Tom is also the founder and owner of Bookminders, a bookkeeping service specializing in complex accounting applications, as well as the producer of Wilson's Fountain, an LLC, which is also engaged in reforming the nominating process for Congress. So let's talk to Tom and get more insight on the AMSP and discuss his vision for revamping the congressional nominating system. Please welcome Tom Joseph to the show. Tom, thanks for coming on. How are you?
Oh, thanks for having me on. Great intro. Really appreciate it.
Yeah, no, absolutely. When you reached out about this topic, I was very intrigued because I hadn't really gotten to dive as much into nominating systems. So really interested to see where this discussion goes. But before we get to America's Main Street Party, I like to always get back to the genesis of why people do what they do on my show. So what ultimately got you interested in trying to reform nominating processes in Congress in the first place?
Well, going way back, it was really following Ross Perot. When I started my company, I lost my job, and I spent the summer watching the conventions and really following that process. And I was really torn on who to vote for. But I always thought, Ross was really pointing out how messed up Congress was, and that we really needed to fix Congress. And my takeaway is that Ross should have probably never run for president. He should just focused on launching a party that would change Congress. And that was the seed of my thought. And I stewed on this for literally 3 decades. This idea of trying to figure out how to reform Congress. And really, the thing that really upset me was the idea of these uncompetitive districts and gerrymandering, and that people got reelected without competing, that it seemed like this really low bar for a really high office. And that bugged me, that uncompetitive districts existed at all. Business would go in there and say, the product's bad. How do you fix it? And that's the genesis of really me trying to wrap my thought around it, going from engineering to accounting to now this.
Yeah, the competitiveness of elections is a big thing for me, and it's really that's not a I put that disclaimer at the top, but it's really not a political opinion one way or another. It's we have a very serious issue with competitiveness, and it's something that I think people of different political persuasions can agree on. It's something I've tried to work towards figuring out myself. Actually led me to write a book, my first book, about why independents struggle so much in elections and how they could potentially become more competitive. Not arguing that I want more independence, I just want more competition. So I could definitely appreciate that. So now let's go ahead and get to AMSP, the America's Main Street Party. So how did you establish AMSP? AMSP, excuse me. And why did you feel it was necessary to create this initiative instead of, for example, get involved in other efforts towards reforming nominating systems? And also, is AMSP an actual third party, or is it just the name of the movement?
No, it is an actual 527 political committee. It's what you need to do. It's the first step of becoming a national party. Um, People confuse this as what you need to do to get on the ballot to be president. That's a very different thing. We are not at all interested in the presidency. This is about the Congress and specifically the U.S. House. And I'm looking at this like not a political scientist, but like a business person. And these are markets. And how do you penetrate the markets given the existing laws? Whereas a political scientist is saying, how do we change the laws to make the system better? And we've got to negotiate with lawmakers. So we can only ask for so much because they're only going to give so much. So if you look at all the election reform efforts, even if they all pass, you get rid of Citizens United, you get ranked choice voting, you get open primaries, our system still sucks. We've taken a really bad system, made a little bit less worse. Still the incumbents are hugely advantaged. So I wanted to how do you rethink this completely? And I wanted to come up with a way to break the system without changing it. And I stumbled upon it.
I like that, you know, you didn't say it in these specific words, but you made that distinction between the practical and the philosophical, because sometimes people get so wrapped up in the I want to change everything now, but you can't. Sometimes you have to work with what you've got right now and then work towards that point. And
Especially when you start something and you're 65 years old. If I was going to
yeah,
drive past the law, I'd be dead by the time that happened. So,
yeah.
I'm there like, hey, I only have so much time. I know I don't want to run for office, and I know changing a law is impossible. So I started to come up with this idea of using a party to create a contest. It was a joke, actually. At first, I said, I'm just going to form an entity and do something. I didn't know what I was going to do, and I was frustrated. The original concept was more like the Forward Party, just kind of like better, more ethics. I don't know. That doesn't really work. Then one day I made a joke. I was like, we do a better job picking the next American Idol than we do the next representative of Congress. And it made me think, that's a moneyless system. You can't buy that contest. You can't, they created a portal. They made mobile voting work. They figured it out. Now we're not going to let everybody vote multiple times, but you can now take technology that operates for banking and all these things that guarantee our security. Almost everybody has FA and face identification in a mobile device. So if you go to purely mobile, not election system, nominating system, we can do some better than what we have. I mean, you can throw stones at it, but what we have is really bad. So give us a shot. It's a sandbox. We can play with it. We're using a political party not as an ideological entity, but as a tech company that's really masquerading inside this entity as and what's really neat about it is that we can't sell the IP, we can't sell the information. Certain information has to be public. So by being a political committee, we have to follow the laws. And the other thing that was interesting is that the loophole that I discovered is that if the contestants don't spend money, the party can do whatever it wants. So it opens the door for us to do whatever we want, create whatever contest we want, because we don't fall into the purview of the FEC. This is what parties do in back rooms with their super donors. They just don't use a computer to do it. They use checks. We're going to use technology to make our back room the entire district. And they're all going to weigh in over 5 rounds and whittle the field down to their top nominee. And so at that point, who do you vote for? The one that the people chose or the one that the rich people from outside the district chose? I mean, I think if we get this in place, it's going to win consistently.
Well, I think that's a good segue into this next part because I want to get more into the process of
Yep.
AMSP so people just get a more concrete sense of what you guys are going for. They hear, oh, this is another third party, but this is a more unique way of going about things. So, what is the basic step by step process of how AMSP works and how exactly does it reform how we nominate candidates for Congress?
But I want to take you one step back. As you mentioned Wilson's fountain. Wilson's fountain is really the big picture. It is defining how we use a national party, a super PAC, local committees, and candidate committees in a very different way. So to look at this as just a party is not a big enough view. What I did is say that, hey, how do we use the entire system differently? The super PAC becomes a marketing department and the prize money for the contest winner. The national party is this tech company. The local committees are like the Olympic trials committee that's going to officiate the contest in the red and blue districts. And then the candidate committees, we can now put rules around them and say, you know what, when you win the contest, your treasurer is going to be one of our guys. And when the general election's over, we're going to empty the account, and you're not going to have a war chest. So in exchange for getting promoted and getting the nomination, getting the super PAC backing, the candidate has to agree that they're not going to accumulate war chests from election cycle to election cycle. Now, this is a system of accountability because now they have to go back through the system and win it. And so if they aren't representing, they're not going to win. now unaffiliated from party whips.
Okay, interesting.
It's a complete election reform without changing the law.
Hey, hey, sometimes that's the way you need to go about it because sometimes it's too difficult to change the law. Because if you got to change laws, you got to get people behind it, and I don't think the two major parties are necessarily interested in changing
They're
these
not
laws
at all interested.
specifically. We have a handful of different ways that we nominate candidates for Congress. It might be a closed primary, open primary, semi-closed, top two, the unique way that
Special
Louisiana does
election?
it, whatever the case may be. So how does AMSP choose which districts to get involved in? Does the calculus change for AMSP based on the type of primary it's operating in, or is it more about the competitiveness or lack thereof of the district?
But our plan is not to run in their primary. We run our own primary and go right to the general election. But there are rules in each state in terms of what it takes to get on the general election ballot before you're a national party. So at this stage, once we get our contest winner, we then have to either get signatures, pay a fee. Most states, the bar to get on the ballot is low. It's like 500, 1,000, or 2% of the previous general election. It's not a big number, especially if we think we've marketed this, correctly. There are certain states like Georgia or Florida that either require so much money, so many signatures, or so much time that I just rule them out. But we're not trying to get all of them. The plan is to do like 10 blue, 10 red, 20 blue, 20 red, enough that if you whittle through that you're not going to win all of them, you still win enough races that neither party is a majority. I think people would get behind the idea that there not being a majority party and us moving away from majority party rule to have force coalitions to pass legislation and not be in this really divisive situation. It'd still be conservative and liberal, but you'd have two moneyless caucuses, one pink, one baby blue, and then you'd have the two parties.
Gotcha. I guess more when I was thinking of with the primaries is more like maybe more so the top two. Obviously, this you're not running in any other party's particular primary, but if there was, top two or top four, I wasn't sure if anything about the strategy
Oh, you mean as far as the general
changed.
election goes?
Yeah, I didn't know if there was any particular change in the tweak in the strategy, but it is much more about the competitiveness of the districts then.
And Paul, it's really about the numbers. So we're looking at
Okay.
a district that is not naturally uncompetitive districts where nobody, it's 90% blue and 90 some percent red. It's a gerrymandered district. Is typically the winner has 2/3 to 80% of the vote. And in a district like that, the plan is that even if let's say a heavily blue district, it got split, that the conservative would still not be able to win if there's two strong blue candidates splitting the vote, and vice versa. So that would be the number. It's over. If you're over 2/3, you can split it, and the opposition party still likely can't compete. So we want to go into districts where the opposition party has a lot of votes, but they know they can't win. So they're more likely to push for, in a red district, a pink non-Republican, in a blue district, a baby blue non-Democrat, because that's how much the parties hate each other. So
Yeah.
you're kind of like leveraging, say that hey, first we're going to attract disaffected Democrats and Republicans to participate in this, and we're going to attract people from the opposition party, and show that through this process you can elevate center left and center right candidates that can win in the general election.
Gotcha. And the other point that you had was, you're talking about how people get on the ballot. And that's one of the big things I talked about in my book too. And I've talked about it other times on this podcast is, you know, yes, there's the either you pay to get on the ballot or you get a certain number of petition signatures. But in a lot of places, independents don't even have the chance to, or third parties, no parties, whichever whatever your definition of independent is, but they a lot of times have to get more petition signatures, a lot more, and they don't even have the option to pay the filing fees. It can make things a lot more difficult for a lot of these independent candidates. But I would be interested to see if having
We have
much
the
more.
data on all 50 states for Ballotpedia. We have it chronologically organized. And technically, if we found a super PAC person this year, we're not completely ruling out this. I don't want to do a bad effort. I'd rather wait and actually, I'm a project manager, business, I don't want to do some flailing plan. If you're running, trying to win an election, whether you're ready financially, you go, we don't need to do that. We can just wait. And our goal is to just get to the next step of the business plan. And if that takes 2 months, 2 years, whatever, we're just going to keep marching down the path to eventually market this.
Gotcha. And shout out to Ballpedia, former employer of mine. But now, one particular question I really wanted to get your take on. Obviously, I wanted to get your takes on all of these, but this is something that I've done several episodes about, and something that's particularly important to me is a common problem that we have with politics is voter apathy. And you see in a lot of primary elections as well, with very low rates of voter turnout, whether people can't vote in the primaries because it's a closed primary and they're an independent, or they just are like, I'll just let all the other people who are more in tune with these candidates just pick the candidates, whatever the case may be. So the lack of voter turnouts for various reasons. But how does this plan for America's Main Street Party getting on the ballot, how does that address that? How will people be more incentivized to participate in the process of filtering, sorting, and reviewing the field of potential nominees?
Well, the apathy is that why engage? I mean, it is our primary system is so bad, so uncompetitive. I mean, it's terrible advertising, and people are so sick of the way politics work today. And so, to me, the create a compelling event. I mean, think about the Olympics. People watch curling, and there's really nothing magical about curling, but NBC makes it compelling. And I think this is really about producing the contest that's compelling. And so what we're doing is we're saying, hey, the local committee will identify 7 issues that are coming before Congress in the next cycle. To get on through into the contest, you got to take positions on that. So imagine you got 75, 100 candidates. It's free. You're going to get a lot of people. There's going to be a bar. You're going to have to get 100 people of your friends to endorse you to get into the contest. So you fill out this stuff, you answer these questions. The local committee, like an HR department, kind of screens, make sure that you actually did serve in that branch of the military. And then you're out in the field. And at this point, as a constituent, you can download the app, play this like Wordle, and say, hey, these 4 issues are important to me. Oh, there's 30 people that match me. I'm going to endorse them. You could do it with one button. It's called approval voting, where you can send forth all the people you approve. And so we'll use approval voting for the first 3 rounds. So it's going to go from the field to a top 20, to a top 10, to a top 4. And then at this point, we're going to introduce new content in like a virtual town hall format, where the local committee will have more questions, and the final 4 will be able to, post additional video content responding to that, so the constituents have more to weigh in on. And at this point, we have the ability to change. We can do ranked choice voting to advance the top 2 or pick 2, and then have a final debate between the top 2 in another round. But I would see, like in a reality contest, you're going to have more people voting as it goes through. In an election system, if you ask people to go back out for another, typically the turnout goes down. It's because balloting is a hassle. If we make this that it's like, playing your daily Wordle, I think people will do it.
That's an interesting way to put it. And I've had several guests on here with various different apps for what they're trying to do, and I think that is, probably the most accessible way for people to get involved in whatever the reform effort is at hand. So I can definitely understand that. And then that's another thing too, is this, not just a ballot information gap, but this, for a lot of people, they think voting is just simple. You just go to a polling place, you just cast your vote, and you're on your way. But a lot of people find it much more difficult. They might not know all the specific rules for when they can register the vote, or they have trouble getting to a place where they can go and get themselves registered because they're out in the boonies, or some other place that makes it hard for them to register, or there's a whole bunch of other things that could potentially make things more difficult for them. And sometimes it's hard for people to appreciate that getting registered to vote and going to vote are not as easy as some people think. Now, they're much easier than they were, obviously, like 40, 50 years ago. But at the same time, a lot of these reform efforts, yours as just one example is, you have to make things as accessible as possible for people to get involved. So I can appreciate, the breakdown that you had there. But no matter what reforms you propose, no matter what it is that you're arguing for, you're trying to change, there's always going to be somebody that's ready to push back against your idea for whatever reason. Maybe it's
Yep.
for maybe it's an honest reason, maybe it's dishonest because they just don't like what you have to say and they're trying to tank your proposal. But I wanted to get your take on a few potential pushbacks, whether or not you've heard these criticisms before. And it's
Sure.
always good to always,
Fire away.
be ready for whatever somebody is going to try to throw back at you. So what would you say to somebody who just looks at this and says, nah, this is impractical. The power of the parties and their money, it's just too strong to overcome. What do you say to people who are still not convinced that this is doable?
Well, there's a lot. I mean, we're really looking to find early adopters. And our first step is to really, instead of try this in election, is to actually get the app to simulate the contest. So it's like, hey, why don't you try it out? We don't have to wait for November or May. You can just play with it. And we're going to have the app. There'll be a field of 100 candidates who have taken their positions. We're going to have two districts are Philadelphia 1 and 2, or PA 1 and 2. One's red, one's blue. And we're putting this simulation together. And so try it out.
Okay. So not even the actual election. You're just making or you're not actually necessarily getting involved in the real election itself. It's more of just like the actual concept, like, hey, if we were actually doing this, here's how you can vote, kind of thing. Am I understanding that
Yeah,
correctly?
right.
Okay.
So don't knock it till you try it.
Gotcha. And that's another thing too, is people try to I find that really granular step by step process interesting because yes, it can be very cumbersome and tedious to try to do every little step, and it's very easy to just try to jump to the end and we need to just get this specific thing done now. And it's no, you have to have some build up, and I think that's something that a lot of uh, the independent movement has struggled with, and I talk about in the book, is sometimes people just try to jump ahead and like, we got to get an independent president. Well, there's a million reasons why that's not going to happen the very next election. You still have to build up. Look at your local level offices. Look at your state level offices. You see in a lot of state governments, for example, there's not a whole lot of them, but you definitely see a lot more third parties and no party people in states like Maine and Alaska and several other states where that's a lot more viable. But in any case, just to bring that back to here, that real step by step process, I can really understand that. And you'll be able to actually build the data for that proof of concept to show, hey, no, this thing can work, and here's how. So on your website, another pushback that somebody might say on your website, when it talks about your plan, it says after the party nominee is chosen, immediate campaign will be funded by the super PAC. Now, while people hear that, they might become a lot of times they might become wary and start thinking, oh, super PAC, oh, we're talking about big money, I don't know if I like this. They start thinking about the power of money in politics. So what would you say to these people? What misconceptions do you want to clear up when it comes to how these America's Main Street Party campaigns are funded and run?
This is really, gets back to the Wilson's Fountain issue and how we're using a super PAC in a very different way. Yes. So, and I had a really hard time myself wrapping my head around this, is that I think, up until I came up with this idea, super PACs are evil. They're backing either individuals or candidates or positions. And there's a lot of dark money. But what if we created a super PAC that was open and transparent and backed the people's choice? We've never had a super PAC that's done common good. I mean, and it would do it equally red and blue. So if the super PAC, say it raises $100 million, it's going to say that, hey, we run 10 red and 10 blue winners. They're saying we're going to apply that money across those 20 districts equally and try to win and try to create at the same time these pink and baby blue caucuses. And from that standpoint, this is what the election attorney, when I presented to him, he's like, wow. He realized that I was kind of recreating the public election system within this little model that I've done. And now this would be like the government saying, you know what, we're going to apply this to make sure that the public can know equally about these candidates that you've chosen. And it's a completely common, good use of the super PAC. So what I'm trying to do is find my Ross Perot. I'm not Ross Perot wealthy. I did okay to do this, but I need to find like a Mark Hughes or somebody like that that would say, you know what, do this. This is how I, attach my. I'm not putting my foot on the R's or the D's. I'm putting my foot on the public, and I'm giving them this money to restore their voice really, and get their people in Congress, not the party people.
Go on that small donor approach that you occasionally see big, candidates go for. And yeah, campaigns have more small donor donations than people think, but obviously, yes, there's still just a significant amount of money through these super PACs. And for people at home, super PACs, the main thing about them is, yes, they can spend unlimited amounts of money, but they can't coordinate with the campaign. If you do, you're going to go to jail. But you can spend unlimited amounts of money as long as you're not coordinating with the campaign.
We
So
actually, I had
that's a
one of
really
the
interesting way to do that. Go ahead.
we had the interns. I had one of these law interns research that. There's only been one case, and it went in favor of the super PACs. It's like this coordination. It's really, yes. I cannot be CEO of the party and have you can't do that. There's timing issues, but we can lay out an overall game plan, and then once the election comes, as long as we're not coordinating, it's fine. But they could run this marketing campaign, a general marketing campaign for all 20 or 40 of these folks, and then you use the local committees to run the ground campaign and the grassroots part of this. And through that, you've got like an advertising strategy and a way to do it. I tell you, this could be a really efficient way to turn the tables on the parties.
Gotcha. Are there any, before we move on to the next
Sure.
sort of subtopic, are there any other potential misunderstandings about the America's Main Street party system in particular that you often encounter, and how would you clear up those misconceptions?
Well, that it's a party. I mean, it is a party. It's really kind of it's an app. And I think people the misperception is that the perception when you hear America's Main Street Party, you think, oh, they're looking for candidates. No, we're looking for districts that are ripe for disruption. And that we'll have a strategy that's 10 black, 10 blue, 10 red. We'll always do an equal number. So the party itself will distribute these contests equally, so that we're not putting our foot on the scale to say, hey, we want to push Congress more red or more blue. It'll be up to the districts, to figure out. But the first cycle we might do 5 and 5, the next 10 and 10, and then maybe a couple Senate.
Gotcha. This just occurred to me now. I don't think we quite touched on it at the beginning. Why choose Main Street Party for the name of this movement and this party?
Well, every place has a main street. It could be a big one, a small one, a conservative one, liberal one, but we all have to meet on Main Street and do business. And at the end of the day, this is all about jobs and paying the bills and having a nice, way of living. And it's not working these days, and if you talk about that apathy, if you give people the tool to say, hey, we actually might be able to change the system for the better, and they can't stop us. There's really operating within the existing system, just using it in a very different way.
Gotcha. That makes sense. And I know a lot of this context has been, or actually, before we get to outside of Congress, there was something I came across on your website. I haven't had a chance to really read it, but it says, how does free and equal candidate selection impact Congress in two-party, multi-party, and no-party systems? So obviously, America's a two-party system, but you'll see other countries that are multi-party and no-party. And actually talked a little bit about this with my guest from last week. But could you give us a sort of a basic breakdown of what this is about, this free and equal candidate selection and these different kinds of party systems and how it differs, how it's the same?
Well, the thing about the parties exist for money to win elections. That's really their only purpose. Caucuses exist within Congress to bind people ideologically in subgroups. And there's more caucuses than there are parties. The caucuses get married by the money. So if we break that marriage, there's no factions within the public. The factions exist within Congress. And we would then identify with, you're Paul, you're in this faction, I'll vote for you because I'm with that faction. So there's a political scientist called Lee Drutman who Um, and Jesse, they put something in Times. They're saying that, hey, if we eventually got to a multi-party system, what would the caucuses look like? And what this paper that C.C. Duncan wrote, she was a senior political science major at Pennsylvania. She explored this idea that as we first we had this system, then as soon as you have a system where neither party is a majority, things change. And she quickly kind of does a synopsis of how things change. Then once you get the bigger factions, how Congress changed them, then at some point, the political parties could evaporate because Madison said we needed necessary factions. He didn't say necessary political parties, and the word political party existed in the time that he wrote that. The word that didn't exist, caucus. So he may have actually been describing that the factions that were necessary were within the Congress, not necessarily within the public. We've created this division ourselves. This is not a united state. It could be that the factions just need to be there. That's the money list. That's the evolution that we would see, is that they would eventually, the parties become powerless. You have a moneyless system, but you still need people to, otherwise you have chaos in Congress. You need caucuses that would advance legislation, negotiate, and eventually pass it and we go to president.
That's an interesting point you make about how caucuses were, not a thing however many years ago, but the whole factional discussion still applies to them. And you go back to James Madison and what he wrote about in Federalist Paper number 10, and just how relevant what he said about factions is to today. And that's one of the things I always think about whenever I'm doing what I'm doing, because obviously try to keep this stuff as nonpartisan, non-ideological as possible. And obviously there's a lot of factionalism going around, which can sometimes make that challenging, but it's work that's worth doing. So now let me go ahead and move to away from Congress, because I always try to emphasize how it's not just federal government. And a lot of people focus on the federal government, not enough on the state, and certainly not enough on the local. But at the same time, obviously, whenever you're involved in reform efforts, it's hard to get involved in all those levels of government. So this discussion has been entirely in the context of Congress. Are there plans at some point to extend this to the state and local levels of government, or can AMSP be implemented in the same way at the state and local level that it is for Congress?
Well, in terms of the nominating tools that we're working on, we're looking at developing this in a way that's configurable and that can be used in different types of formats. The format that we have that works at the congressional level would work at a state legislative level, I believe, without any change. It's smaller districts. The concept, though, is really about breaking gerrymandering. So putting this kind of contest into like a mayoral race, it may improve it, but we need improvement in other areas. People say, hey, why don't you try this out in a borough? Or I said, no, I mean, I get you want a smaller population, but we have to break gerrymandering. This is, if you guys want to do ranked choice voting in mayor's race, great, have at it. But to me, I'm working on a different problem. It involves representatives, legislative representatives, either the state or U.S. level. The reason we pick U.S. is really just about raising money. I think if I just said, hey, I'm going to do this in Pennsylvania, 49 other states to say, hey, let us know when you come up with something. So with this plan where we can go out, and we might be in your state, we may not, but if the overall plan could make the whole Congress better, then everybody has a reason to donate.
Gotcha. That and that makes sense. And also not to mention the fact that a lot of local races, not all of them, but a lot of local races are nonpartisan. So there's the gerrymandering isn't really at, all that relevant to that level either. So I can understand
That's
that
why we
basic
want to stay
concept.
away from swing districts. It gets ugly.
Right.
So if we go into a solidly conservative, solid liberal district, we know what the questions are. We know a conservative isn't going to win in a liberal district and vice versa. So it's really going to be about, hey, what shade of blue are you? And we think when you take money away from it, it's going to move it center.
And that's another thing too, is I've talking to different independent operatives before about how they determine where to run candidates in, and there is a little bit of debate amongst themselves as to whether to go into a competitive district that has both viable Republican and Democratic candidates, and then or should you just take one that's heavily one way or another, or if it goes too heavily. And that kind of goes back to what you were talking about there with picking decidedly red and blue districts, but not ones that are like so 90% plus that you can't possibly have somebody else winning them either. So
But if
did
I
just
were
thought about
running
that.
today as an independent, I'd want to run in a swing district that's, highly competitive, because you could create the situation that people are sick with both parties. So if I was, somebody that was just running on my own without, to me, the secret of what we're doing is that it elevates somebody that people they come to a consensus on them over a 4 or 5 week period. So they feel like, just like when somebody wins the 100-yard dash, the Olympics, you really know that is the fastest person in the world. You're buying their Wheaties. So that's, it's really the same kind of thing. As they compete through, there's this brand identity that people will get with them as they survive each round. And it happens in American Idol, it happens in Survivor, it happens in all these things. The reason why somebody can't win in a primary, it's the first time people are hearing about them, and people are just lazy. So if you create a vehicle where you can actually elevate them, they're going to be the favorite, coming into that general election, because people say, hey, they earned it.
And not to mention that in the primary, a lot of times it's who has that local level name recognition and people in the district backing them already. And America's Main Street Party is kind of emulating that already. And it kind of made me think when you're talking about how, in order to get even considered for a nomination, you have to have, I believe you said, 100 friends and family nominate them. So
Yeah.
almost like there's a primary before the primary
Well,
in some ways.
I'm trying to actually emulate the general election. Like, just to get on the
Okay.
general election ballot, you'd have to have 1,000 signatures. So, we had to have some bar. There's going to be some work required to build out and submit certain information. All the information you have to submit to run for the actual election, we want to get that up front. So if you have tax returns, finance, whatever the disclosures are for Congress, you're going to have to submit those before you enter the contest. We don't want to find out later that you're not going to do this, or that you decide that you don't want to give your financial disclosures. That is ridiculous that the candidates are setting their own rules. They work for us.
Yeah. And I get that you don't want to necessarily have all of your private stuff put out there for people to know, but also people need to know if you've got any sort of baggage.
If you win, it's required.
Yeah.
What are you going to do? It's get up to the time they're going to put you in Congress, say, oh, no, I can give you my financial disclosures? Of course not. So, if you need to submit that information to take the job, then you submit it up front.
Yeah.
Otherwise, don't run.
Right. Right. So obviously, we touched on this a little bit. And obviously, people hear about this whole concept and think, okay, well, maybe it is practical to do this. And let's say that they have been convinced of that. I like to always have at least one question specifically dedicated to actionable info for listeners. So maybe now people are sold on what you're trying to sell them on. Say, okay, you know what? America's Main Street Party. I want to know how I can get involved. So, what are some practical takeaways you can give for how people can get involved in changing how this nominating process works and how they can get involved with AMSP?
Well, eventually I want them to be able to download the app and play with it. I think we're probably still weeks away from them being able to play with it on the website. It can take a little bit longer to get it into the App Store. But engaging with it, telling other people about it, having hope. I think right now, when people look at it in 2024, I think $100 million is spent on election reform efforts. The statewide efforts went 0 for 8. So it's hard to have a lot of hope when, people are trying to make the election systems better. And the only thing that the parties agree on is stopping those initiatives. And, so going to the website, there's a page called A Brand New Way, and there's a 1-minute video that kind of explains the contest, like in a really quick way that you can really wrap your head around what we're trying to do. And it also explains that. And what I really like to do is get people to, ultimately we want donations, but even if you just go on our change.org, we have a change.org petition, signing that, showing that there's traction, because ultimately we want a super donor to back us. And they'll really only do that if we can show that we are getting people to engage with the idea and like it. And right now, the traction, we only started marketing this really in January. We've been on 30 podcasts in like 2 months. So there's at least podcasters like it. But there is, I think people are saying, hey, this is interesting. I want my audience to hear about it. There's frustration with the system as it exists. So, yeah, I think educating yourself, becoming an early adopter, telling your friends, like, share, follow.
Gotcha. Well, I'll also give you a chance at the end of this to promote any specific links you want to share, and then you can just say those specific ones, and then I'll put those in the show notes. But before we get to that, one more question about this actual topic on hand. Any final thoughts you'd like to leave us with when it comes to reforming candidate nominating systems, free and equal representation, or America's Main Street Party, or anything else related to those concepts?
Yeah, I mean, the last question on our FAQs that I put on there, could this work for a presidency? And imagine this at some point down the road where we've implemented this in a lot of districts and everybody has a cell phone on, say, hey, here's 30 people. Let's say they have the nation weigh in on them. Okay, now we got a top 10, then a top 4. Not this ridiculous system we have where what people in Iowa or New Hampshire set the course of who's going to be the president. We should all weigh in at the same time and whittle the field like we're going to do for Congress. So that would be my long-term goal, is to, you know, come up with a way to come up with an original slate and to whittle a field for president down and then put that person up against this crappy candidates these parties are coming up with.
Yeah, that's an interesting point too. Especially, you talk about, I think it's New Hampshire, that they have it in
Yeah.
law that they are supposed to be one of the first, if not the first primary in the nation. Like, it actually is in their laws. And it made me think of back at my undergraduate days. There was a book we read. I forget which edition it is, but I have it up here on my shelf somewhere. But it's called "Debating the Presidency," and it's about all these various debates surrounding presidential power and how we select them. And one of the things was making regional primaries instead of state by state. So it might be like Northeast, for example, then Pacific, or whatever the case may be. But I don't as often hear the idea of just make everybody vote at the same time, and then there's going to be several rounds. So that's a interesting way to go about it. So, you know what? Maybe that'll be a good topic for a podcast. Is thinking about ways that the presidential nominating system can be changed. So thank you for that idea. I'll have
Yeah, a
to
people's primary for
research that.
president. But I think we're going to knock this down like the Constitution. Start with the House, then the Senate, president.
Well, there you go. Thank you so much for going so in depth with America's Main Street Party. And obviously, like I said, I'll give you a chance to share some links that you want people to see. But before we get to that, why don't you just go a little bit of a lighter topic? So at the end of interviews, and for those of you who are new to the show, whenever I interview somebody, I like to have a random question of the day. It's just something that's more fun and light and
Uh-oh.
gives a different. Oh, don't worry, it's not going to be anything
Okay.
crazy, but I try to give a different side to the guest as well, because variety is the spice of life. So, Tom, today's random question of the day for you is: what is a weird pet peeve you have that you're not sure many or any other people have?
Many or other people, pet peeves. Well, people stand when they should be moving. So and I don't know if it's a Pittsburgh thing, but people stand on our moving sidewalks here at the airport. That drives me nuts. Or people that get off a plane and they're right there at the end and they stand. I want to blow up when that happens. That is my pet peeve. People that don't realize they're blocking people getting by. And
I'm sure a lot of people would agree with you there. I don't go on moving sidewalks enough to encounter that, but just thinking about it makes me mad. So I can definitely agree with that.
we have a new airport now, so I'm not going to get as irritated because they phased out a lot of that.
Gotcha. So for me, a pet peeve that I don't know if there's probably some people, but this is just a really weird one that started cropping up for me more and more on these social media ads. These people are holding very, very tiny microphones, these like little ones with like 3 fingers and holding up like this. I can't tell you why. It just looks so stupid and I hate it. It's one of these innocuous things that really does not matter, but it's just drives me crazy. Hold up an actual sized microphone. Stop this nonsense with this. Like they're holding it with 3 fingers. Just looks goofy.
You're right. This is a recent thing that I've noticed.
Yeah.
Good one.
Okay, good. So I'm not totally crazy. Somebody else is with me on this. Yeah, sometimes I've said this before, but sometimes I try to find things that really don't matter to get mad about, so I don't, blow up against things that actually do matter, that are more serious. So sometimes the catharsis is a little, a
Usually the
little
people holding
uplifting.
those microphones look so good that you're willing to forgive that.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't care. I don't care what they look like. They just I'm
They're
just
like
looking.
models,
I'm just looking at the microphone, so I'm not even paying attention to what they look like.
and they're selling something.
Yeah. Give me a regular sized microphone. Just stop it. But in any case, Tom, thank you very much for being on
Sure.
here. See, the random question wasn't bad. I don't throw any like real curveballs or anything like that. It's just usually just something just
Appreciate it.
goofy. Yeah. But before we officially wrap up, what
Oh, yeah.
links do you want to share specifically?
Sure. To learn about America's Main Street Party, go to mainstreetparty.org. Like I said, there's a page called A Brand New Way, which talks about the contest. Another one, the proof of concept page, is the work that the interns did. We have college students working on a shoestring here to get where we've gotten. Another website is wilsonsfountain.us. Wilson's Fountain is a LLC of mine. It's kind of like a sandbox where we can do things that don't need to be associated with the party, but really research around free and equal elections. I call it my undergraduate think tank because I've got, students from Penn, Drexel, Haverford. Try to hire interns around the Philadelphia area because this idea has its roots in James Wilson, who was the first law professor at University of Pennsylvania. He wrote the U.S. Constitution and the Pennsylvania Constitution. I mean, the person who drafted it was James Wilson. He's a constitutional nerd. Never gets any credit for what he did. One of the first class of Supreme Court justices.
Oh, there you go. I can always appreciate when somebody shouts out a founding father or a framer who doesn't get their due.
He
That's
has no
definitely one of them.
statue to tear down.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'll definitely share those links in the show notes below. And that's going to wrap things up for here. So
Okay.
my notes or my links is my LinkedIn, my Facebook, my 5-day educational email course about how we can more effectively decrease and mitigate polarization in this country, because a lot of the ways we do it is actually ineffective or has the opposite effect. My book on Amazon, ebook and paperback format, the one I mentioned about independence and how they could potentially become more competitive. My medium.com profile, where I write on from time to time, and website, and paulrader.org, and my email, paulraderwrites@gmail.com. So we are going to wrap things up here. Please like, comment, share, and subscribe. And you always find this on YouTube, Spotify, and Apple Podcasts. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next time.